Thank you so much. Can all of you hear me? Wonderful. Thank you so much for this very generous gift. I can make use of this hoodie, this sweater in Doha because it can get quite cold with all the air conditioning. Yeah. Big thanks also from me to you, Stefano, to you, Paul, and to Mohammed Al-Amri and to Dean Abdul Karim Marzouk for making my lectures here possible. And big thanks to all of you for coming. Can I ask you, how many of you were here yesterday for my other talk? Right. Wonderful. Most of you. You will perhaps recognize that star system again. This is the TRAPPIST-1 star system, an artist's impression. A system with 7 Earth-like planets that were discovered in 2017. A very, very exciting discovery that a Moroccan observatory at Ukhaymidin, south of Marrakesh, was part of. Yesterday I was talking about the past of, or the recent past of Arab space exploration. But today is more about the future. I was exploring yesterday some of the resources that Arab states were employing for space exploration. The focus was on states because often states, that is governments, have more than any private organization the capacity to go into space or have had it for the longest time, although this is now changing with space tourism and private space companies such as SpaceX becoming more important. So what do you need in order to get into space? What do governments need to get into space? They need technology, right? To go into space for Arab countries or developing countries in general, but also for advanced countries. That typically means collaboration, and that means sharing technology. That means benefiting from the inventions of other countries as well. That means the adoption of an ideology to some extent of cosmopolitanism, of internationalism, right? If you want to share space technology, benefit from other people's space technology, I mean, you have to push the idea of space exploration being an effort of all mankind, of all humanity together. So technology is one of the resources that one needs to go into space. But does one need anything else to go into space? Resources as in?
Money.
Not necessarily money, but engineering, rockets,
Right.
the fuel to actually go to space.
Right. Yeah.
Also need some motivators because going to space needs a lot of resources, and we're not gaining anything from it technically. So we really need to convince the people that the government needs to convince the people that the area where they're spending money on will be worth it in like 100 or 200 years.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So some of the things that you mentioned, sort of the engineering and so on, that I would put under technology. The convincing, as well as sort of other resources, that has to do with money. So in order to go into space, in order to reach the moon, the Mars, or anything, you need technology, but you also need money. And that means for governments, you need to convince people that space exploration is worth their effort. And this is where often nationalism comes into play, right? You need to sort of show that space exploration is nationally important, is important for one's country, for one's security, for one's wealth, for the health of the nation, the growth of the nation, and so on. However, there's a third ingredient. So we have technology, one needs money, but one also needs the imagination, right? But before one can go to the moon, one needs to imagine going to the moon. Before we go to other star systems, one needs to imagine going to other star systems. And so science, space science in particular, and the imagination are really part of one another. And this is especially true with, for instance, exoplanet research. I showed you that artist's impression of the TRAPPIST-1 planetary system. This is what the discovery of these exoplanets actually looks like to the scientists. We see drops in brightness. Here it says in bracket astronomical transits. So you have these planets passing in front of their star, and the star is so much brighter than these planets, and any exoplanets are so far away, and the stars are so far away that we cannot see these planets directly. What we can measure is tiny drops in the light that is coming from the stars, right, at regular intervals, and this then tells us something about, for instance, the length of the orbit of that planet. And if we use ever better telescopes to look at that star, then we can try to find out something about the size of the planet, the composition of the planet, and so on. But of course, if you want money for this kind of research, right? If you want taxpayers' money, you can't just show them this. That wouldn't get people excited, right? This is much more exciting, right? If you can show an artist's expression of these 7 Earth-like planets, right? What we imagine they could look like. And NASA and the JPL Caltech, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena in California, they employ artists in order to help sell these missions, in order to inspire people, in order to contribute to the outreach of those missions. So this is what excites people. What is even more exciting is perhaps an artist expression like this one, which shows the surface of what one of these Earth-like planets could look like. So here again you see a sort of science, imagination really supporting one another, imagination feeding science, and then science feeding the imagination. And for life outside of Earth, the imagination is particularly important because we haven't yet any proof that there is life, right? So all we have is the imagination. I mentioned at the end of my last talk yesterday the Emirati ambitious plans to reach Mars. There's this Emirates Mars mission for 2020-2021 to send an unmanned orbiter to study the Martian atmosphere. In 2017, also another project was announced, the Mars 2117. So the Emiratis have a project to build over the course of the next 100 years a whole city on Mars. And this was unveiled at the World Government Summit in Dubai. And here you can see Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the ruler of Dubai, in some virtual reality environment, looking at what the Emirati is imagining their city on Mars could look like. And even the mission that was announced earlier, so that Emirates Mars mission of 2020, that already came with a lot of images, imaginations, including outreach activities for children, including, for instance, a magazine called The Red Planet by the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center. And part of that kids magazine is also a story in multiple parts about an alien encounter. Here you can see a female Emirati astronaut meeting strange creatures from outer space, or the other way around, these alien creatures meeting a very strange human from Earth. and so on. So science fiction is part of these Emirati space projects. However, what about the Arab world as a whole? What about the Muslim world as a whole? How much resources in terms of imagination does the Muslim world have? Right? We mentioned the Arab world has a lot of technology and can acquire a lot of technology through calibration. Many Arab countries are very wealthy, and by pooling their resources, Arab countries could certainly have the money to do some exciting space projects. But what about the combined, whatever, Arab-Muslim imagination, right? How much is there if all Muslim countries were pooling their imagination of outer space? Obviously, if countries like the United Arab Emirates, they have money to pay designers of magazines, right? They have money to hire film crews or virtual reality production companies and so on. However, science fiction is also being produced under much more difficult circumstances. And one example is the collage series from 2016, Damascus Under Siege, by Iham Jabr. Iham Jabr is a graphic designer who lives in Damascus in a small apartment, and in his spare time he creates collages with little more than a laptop, a cracked copy of Photoshop, and whenever he has electricity and internet access, images that he finds on Google together with old photographs of Damascus. So here you can see like his collage series of an alien invasion over Damascus. And perhaps this is his own way of dealing with the Syrian civil war, the Syrian revolution, the Syrian war that has been destroying the country since 2011, right? Maybe this is his way of sort of portraying all the different foreign forces that have been fighting over Syria, whether it's Iranian or Russian or Israeli or French or American, and so on. And by the way, he is just one of sort of many, many artists who have been still doing their work amidst all the difficult circumstances of wartime Syria. And if you want to find more about creativity, resilience in Syria, you can look at Miriam Cook's book, Dancing in Damascus. However, she mainly looks at oppositional artwork, right? Iham Jabr's collages are not oppositional, right? It would be hard to live in Damascus at the moment and do really anti-regime art. At the same time, it's not very clearly propaganda artwork for the regime either, right? It's not that here you have in these images Bashar al-Assad being the heroic defender of Earth against the invaders, right? In some ways, it's a more a work that is sort of beyond that binary of regime and rebels or opposition and government, and so on. And interesting, it's also not the only science fiction that has been produced in Syria, even under the conditions of civil war. An example is there's a whole Arabic magazine called Al-Khayal al-Ilmi, science fiction produced by the Syrian Ministry of Culture. Here you can see an issue from 2011, issues from 2011, and the person behind that is Talib Omran, Syrian science fiction author, also professor at Damascus University, a broadcaster, a science popularizer, and he convinced the Syrian government to support science fiction, to publish this magazine. And this magazine has continued into the war, and not only that, there have been more science fiction magazines produced in Syria. So this is 2013, 2014, a magazine called Scientific Literature, Al-Adab Al-Ilmi. And there you can see on the covers images of global science fiction franchises. So there's the Alien from the Alien franchise, and then there's the Starship Enterprise from the Star Trek, the Next Generation series. Here you have images are taken from Star Wars. So even though Syria was under sanctions from the US, even though the US was opposing the Syrian regime, you still had a magazine, in this case published by Damascus University, employing these American science fiction franchise productions, and so on. Now, why would the Syrian government continue to support science fiction during the war, right? During a time of sort of scarce resources? Is it part of Syrian regime propaganda in order to show that, sorry? No. Okay. Is it part of it, like a Syrian regime's propaganda effort to show that, well, we're not so bad after all, we're still promoting culture? Is it part of just by the Syrian government to show continuity amidst all of the revolution, to say, well, we just keep on going, producing art, we ignore the revolution that is happening, we ignore the war that is happening? I don't think so that it is a propaganda tool, partly because these magazines, they are mainly distributed in Syria, right, under the conditions of war. They're in Arabic, so this is not some kind of foreign propaganda in order to show how friendly towards creativity the Syrian government is. If you ask the Syrian Minister of Culture, he would say, well, this is part of a Syrian governmental effort to encourage kids to go into science, kids to go into engineering, and so on, which would contribute to the strength of the nation. Well, but it is still surprising that the Syrian government would support science fiction. It would be surprising to critics of Arab governments in general, critics such as the British journalist Brian Whitaker, who published around the same time as the Syria launched its first science fiction magazine, a book called What's Really Wrong with the Middle East. And in that book he writes, drawing, for instance, on the Arab Human Development Report of the United Nations. Education in the Arab countries is where the paternalism of the traditional family structure, the authoritarianism of the state, and the dogmatism of religion all meet, discouraging critical thought and analysis, stifling creativity, and instilling submissiveness. And then he quotes that Arab Human Development report saying, studies indicate that the most widespread style of child rearing in Arab families is the authoritarian mode, accompanied by the overprotective. This reduces children's independence, self-confidence, and social efficiency, and fosters passive attitudes and hesitant decision-making skills. Most of all, it affects how the child thinks by suppressing questioning, exploration, and initiative. Further, Brian Whitaker quotes this Arab Human Development Report saying that curricular, teaching, and evaluation methods do not permit free dialogue and active exploratory learning, and consequently do not open the doors to freedom of thought and criticism. On the contrary, they weaken the capacity to hold opposing viewpoints and to think outside the box. And like reading this, it makes it surprising, perhaps, right? Why would the Syrian government support science fiction as a way of thinking outside of the box, right? Why would the Emirati government, which is also known to be quite repressive, publish stories of encounters with purple aliens and so on, right? Is this a way for the government to allow the society to let off some steam, like in some ways as a safety valve, that if the population can enjoy some science fiction, then they won't think about all the societal problems that they might have? Well, in any case, it seems that the role of the state in supporting science fiction or promoting science fiction deserves further attention, further investigation. Brian Whittaker already mentioned the dogmatism of religion. So what is religion saying in the Muslim world about science fiction? Well, it depends who you ask. But there are some conservative scholars who are quite opposed to it. This is a fatwa by Muhammad Munajjid from his website Islam, Question and Answer. So from the late 1990s, he was asked, is it okay to read books on science fiction where a mad scientist creates a human being or a hybrid between a human and an animal? And then the answer is, if these stories include lies, such as Darwin's theory, evolution, and other things that are contrary to the facts stated by Islam and the facts of natural science, then the Muslim should avoid them and keep himself busy with something that will be of use to him, such as learning good things or doing righteous deeds or reading true stories and historical accounts and so on. Many of the movies and novels that are known as science fiction include a lot of kufr, such as putting life and death in the hands of some created being, which creates, giving creatures the ability to create from nothing, saying that scientists and laboratories can create from nothing, making inanimate things come to life, creating life from a fossil that has been dead for a millennia. By the way, this is from the 1990s. That is when Jurassic Park first came out, so that's sort of the reference, creating life from a fossil that has been dead for millennia, or traveling to the future, then coming back to the present. All of this is impossible, and no one knows the unseen except for Allah. Some of these novels and movies also include clear contradictions of historical facts that are mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah, such as man's creation and his life on earth. But when the Muslim indulges in reading these books or watching these movies, it shakes his belief, or at the very least wastes his time and keeps him busy with something that is of no benefit to him. Some people claim that this is just entertainment and a way of passing time, but entertainment is not permitted if it is haram, and the Muslim's time is too precious to be wasted on such trivial things. So here that's at least one conservative Saudi scholar being very opposed to science fiction. Well, but is that the entire Islamic position on science fiction? Well, let's find out. First of all, sort of in response to sort of Brian Whittaker, you don't need to have a democracy to, let's say, encourage thinking outside of the box, right? And a good example is, for instance, Soviet Russia, that produced some of the best science fiction, really, of all times. Science fiction that was also consumed in Arab countries, in Muslim countries. And also the Soviet Union, for instance, which included Muslim-majority republics, Muslim-majority countries in Central Asia in particular, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on. The Soviet Union encouraged space research. Obviously, the Soviet Union was the country that put the first man into space, the first woman into space, the first dog into space, and so on. So really wonderful achievements, even not coming from a democracy. So clearly was a lot of imagination, even under conditions of Stalinism. And there was also imagination of alien life happening in Muslim-majority republics of the Soviet Union, in particular Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan plays a hugely important role in the history of space exploration, partly through its cosmodrome, partly through its spaceport of Baikonur, which was the main port from which Soviet and Eastern Bloc cosmonauts went into space. Also, the Academy of Sciences at Alma-Ata was a leading Academy of Sciences within the Soviet Union. Why would so many leading scientists be stationed in Kazakhstan so far away from Moscow? Well, that actually has to do incidentally with World War II. When German Nazi armies invaded the Soviet Union and drove eastwards, the Soviet Union was basically evacuating during the war as much scientific personnel as possible eastwards into places such as Kazakhstan, leading to a lot of capacity there early on. And one of those astronomers who came to Alma-Ata, nowadays Almaty, was Gavril Tikhov. He was one of the founders of the field of astrobiology, the study of life in the universe. And he was also the person who coined a term called astrobotany, the study of plants on Earth. And he was studying in particular the survival of plants in extreme environments, such as the Pamir Mountains in Central Asia, one of the driest as well as coldest places on Earth. And he was trying to then, he was studying the spectrum of the spectra of these plants in order to find out what Martian plants could look like, right? If this is what plants in the Pamir Mountains or in Siberia look like under a spectroscope. If we hold a spectroscope, an instrument that shows us the spectrum to Mars, could we then detect possible plants on Mars, right? So he was using some of the environments of the Muslim world in order to find out about stuff about life elsewhere in the universe. And he also published globally. I mean, he mainly wrote in Russian, but his publications also made it into journals of here the British Astronomical Association, or this is Gavril Tikhov, or this is here a book translated into English, Reaching for the Stars, where he talks about the step from astrobotany, the field that he was the main founder, towards astrobiology, right? And here it says controversy is father to truth. So somebody, right, who was living under authoritarianism, right, who was living under Stalinism, wasn't afraid of controversy either. What about other Muslim countries? Well, you can see that also other Muslim majority countries, even authoritarianism, even authoritarian ones, supported space research, right? And we talked about this yesterday, how Egypt, for instance, supported space research through the Helwan Observatory. And this kind of space research also inspired Egyptian science fiction. So this is an early Egyptian science fiction movie, Rihla ila al-Qamar, or if you want to pronounce it the Egyptian way, Rihla ila al-Qamar, from 1959, and that was inspired by the Helwan Observatory, the activities there that were state supported. And it was also inspired by a rocket and missile program that Gamal Abdel Nasser was supporting at the time. And in the film, a trio of a German scientist, an Egyptian astronomer, an Egyptian journalist travel on an Egyptian rocket from the Helwan Observatory to the moon, where they discovered lunar women. And this was sort of a theme of science fiction at the time, right? You had movies about cat women from Mars during the 1950s and so on. Egypt was very much part of a global science fiction culture at the time. And probably most countries with a reasonably old film industry at some point made a movie that sounded something like Journey to the Moon. So Muslim majority countries were part of that global imagination. Well, but what about the repressive sides of countries such as Egypt? Well, sometimes even repression encouraged science fiction. Sometimes even repression encouraged imaginations of alien life. So this is even before that science fiction movie, a play called Huriya min al-Merikh, Huri, or fairy from Mars, from 1951. And the story is a little bit like Pygmalion, that Greek myth, and has been compared in the Egyptian press of the time to that Greek myth. And the story goes like that, that a man has fights with his wives, he has troubles with his wife, so he prays to God that God should send him a new wife, essentially, a wife who would be obedient, who would not argue with him, who would fulfill all his wishes, and so on. Basically in that theater play, then God has mercy and sends a Hori, a fairy, to him. And this play was submitted to the censor, and sort of a conservative, turban-wearing censor at the Egyptian government said, oh, that was basically blasphemous, right? So what the writer then did, well, I should say, the original title was Huriya min al-Jannah. Huri, a fairy from paradise, a paradise virgin. And the censor thought that this was completely blasphemous. And so the way around it was, okay, it was not to make it not Huriya min al-Jannah, but Huriya min al-Merikh. So that God would send that man, basically the perfect wife from perfect body, perfect everything, completely obedient. Obviously in the play, the man is not happy in the end, because, I mean, it's just not fun having a partner who agrees with you every time. So in the end, actually, the man wishes to have his wife back and gets his wife back. Anyway, but here you can see sort of making that plot more extraterrestrial, so about a Huri from Mars rather than a Huri from paradise. That was a way to make it more tolerable. There's also been science fiction written in Nasserist prisons. So an example is Ahmad Raif, who was imprisoned with many other leaders and sympathizers of the Muslim Brotherhood under Nasser in the 1960s. Perhaps at that time, you could hardly call yourself a proper intellectual if you weren't at some point in prison. So he was in prison, and of course the prisons were overcrowded, which means there was no solitary confinement, which means he basically was hanging out with all these filmmakers, with all these playwrights, with all these Muslim Brotherhood leaders in prison. And what did he do? Well, he wrote a play called The Fifth Dimension, in which astronauts go to Mars and find the ideal Islamic society there, a society that was superior to communism, superior to capitalism, as also like an American and Soviet astronaut experience. A society in which there's perfect justice, in which the king gets elected, in which there's a council of 100 wise people, in which every citizen can initiate a deposition of the king, right? So essentially an ideal Islamic society. Also, like there's technology so that people can swim in their normal clothes, avoiding nudity. And of course, if you wanted to make a play about the ideal Islamic society or the ideal society, and you are in prison, and if you wanted to implicitly critique your own government, it's probably much better to situate that on Mars, right? If you situated a play like that on Earth, probably the prison authorities would not have agreed with you writing such a play. But so here you can say actually repression enabling science fiction. So I mentioned, so I talked about how the state also has an encouraging role. What about Islam? Well, I mentioned this conservative Saudi scholar who's very against science fiction, but there's also a Saudi standard edition of the Quran and a standard English translation of the Quran, in which you have a commentary on, for instance, here the first chapter, Surah Al-Fatiha, about praise be to Allah, the cherisher and sustainer of the world. And here you say see under footnote 20, the Arabic word Rabb, usually translated Lord, has also the meaning of cherishing, sustaining, and bringing to maturity. Allah cares for all the worlds He has created. Right, so that's this Arabic phrase, Lord of the worlds, Rabb al-Alameen. And it's not alam in the singular, it's alameen in the plural, so suggesting that there is more than one world. Interestingly, it's not the typical Arabic plural for world either. It's not awalim, it is alameen, which is has this een ending, which is typically a male plural. So you have it in nabiyin or banin, muslimin, mu'minin, and etc. Almost suggesting that alameen is sort of somehow perhaps a living or sentient world in some ways. But this is another chapter, and here it says, among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and all, and the living creatures that he has scattered through them, and he has power to gather them together when he wills. And here the footnote said, actually, 4569, in this standard authorized version of the Quran in Saudi Arabia, it says, life is not confined to our one little planet. It is a very old speculation to imagine life like human life on the planet Mars. Though no scientific demonstration is possible, it is reasonable to suppose that life in some form or other is scattered through some of the millions of heavenly bodies scattered through space. What a wonderful sign of Allah. The Almighty who created such countless beings has surely the power to bring them together. So almost like according to the standard version, Saudi version of the Quran, if you believe in the Quran, you have to believe in extraterrestrial life. And this is also a point that has been made by people very distant from the Wahhabi tradition that dominates Saudi Arabia. For instance, the Ahmadiyya, this is Mirza Tahir Ahmad, a former head of the Ahmadiyya. He published a book in English, Revelation, Rationality, and Truth, and there's a whole chapter on the Quran and extraterrestrial life, where he talks about Quranic verses that say, Allah is He who created 7 heavens and of the earth, the like thereof. And he sort of imagines what these creatures could be like. And he says this verse in particular speaks not only of the possibility of extraterrestrial life, but it categorically declares that it does, a claim which even the most modern scientific researchers have not been able to make so far with any measure of certainty. So here again, sort of support in the Quran for extraterrestrial life, for space aliens, as this very, very important ingredient of much of science fiction. um, if the Quran supports the idea of extraterrestrial life, then it's perhaps not surprising that we also find Islamic UFO religions. So religions that come out of Islam or draw on Islam that also employ UFOs. So for instance, there's the Nation of Islam in America, in which the mother plane, a kind of a giant UFO, plays a huge role. Or there is the Nawabian nation, sort of a rival movement of the Nation of Islam, in which you have a man from planet Rizq appearing. Rizq, obviously a Quranic term. And the leader of that religion is called a being from, or calls himself a being from the 19th galaxy, from called Ilyun, which also comes from a Quranic term, Ilyin. And he describes himself as an Illah Mutajassid, an incarnated God. So here he draws this particular leader of a new religious movement, an African American religion, draws on Quranic terms such as rizq or here aliyun, etc., for his own mythology. And there's also, and you not only find those UFO religions flourishing in America, where perhaps if religious freedom allows for an exceptionally great plethora and diversity of religions, but even in places like Turkey, for instance, we see UFO religions emerging, such as the World Brotherhood Union Mevlana Supreme Foundation, led by a woman who sees herself as the incarnation of Rumi, the famous mystic and poet, and UFOs are part of that whole religion too. So Islam not just supports science fiction, not just supports UFO religions, there is also then Islamic science fictions. There are people who engage in Islamic world building, who build worlds using Islam, right? This planet Rizq is one of them. Malaysia has been particularly supportive as a state of Islam in general and Islamic literature in particular, and that includes Islamic science fiction. A former student of the International Islamic University Malaysia, for instance, Azrul Jaini, published a book called Galaxy Muhsinin, Galaxy of the Virtuous, in which he names planets after verses from the Quran, Anfal, Furqan, Hadid, Adiyat, or there's a Saifullah carrier, or there's an Asadullah space cruiser. Or you can see the a Noor rifle, or an AK, not 47, but 470. And so the enemies of the Galaxy of the Virtuous, they carry Uzi 92 guns, so a futuristic version of an Israeli submachine gun. The ruler of that Galaxy of the Virtuous is the Caliph Zulqarnain, sort of using that Quranic term for Alexander the Great, or that Quranic term that is typically associated with Alexander the Great. Who are the enemies of the Muslims in space? Well, there's a Reconquista Confederation from the history of Andalus. They are the space Zionists, but they are also space Nazis. So there's so the Muslims are both fighting the Zionists as well as the Nazis. There's a Volkssturm battalion named after a militia that the Nazis set up in the final days of World War II. There's a Taqwa algorithm as well. So Islamic history and so on has been used by science fiction authors for their world building. Galaxy Muhsinin, or Galaxy of the Virtuous. What will the future now hold? Well, if we do discover extraterrestrial life, obviously this will shape science. Would shape science fiction without doubt. For now, progress has been slow. What we've discovered so far really is macromolecular organic compounds, for instance, from the depth of Enceladus. This is a paper in which Nozair Khawaja, a Pakistani scientist, was involved, and this is a paper published very recently from Nature. So we haven't really discovered life. We've only discovered organic macromolecules, so molecules that include carbon atoms. So this is where we are at right now in terms of astrobiology. And countries like Pakistan are part of that global venture. I mean, here you can see, for instance, the Astrobiology Network of Pakistan, which includes not just Pakistanis, but also people from Germany, for instance, other European countries. But even with so little evidence for extraterrestrial life to go for, people, including the Astrobiology Network of Pakistan, are encouraging the imagination, are, for instance, organizing art competitions here like this one. And even, without us having discovered life elsewhere, we can see exciting artwork being produced across the Muslim world. So this is Saks Afridi. He is a promoter of something that he calls, at some point he calls it South Asian futurism. He's from Pakistan. He also calls it Islamic futurism. He also calls it sci-fi Sufism, what he does. So we can see sort of different terms being used for arts like this. And you can find many more images on Saks Afridi's Instagram account, for instance. Whatever term you use, you can see parallels to other futurisms that have emerged already during the 20th century, right? Beginning perhaps with Italian futurism, but also then futurisms of more minorities, Afrofuturism being another example. And there is a growing movement of Islamic futurism, and all of this points to the Islamic world having wonderful resources for the imagination, right? So amidst all the repression, all the authoritarianism, amidst all the wars and conflicts that are waging in different Arab and Muslim majority countries, amidst all the problems, amidst all the conservatives, right, amidst all the people who sort of want to narrow one's thinking in some ways, one can see a wonderful diversity of creativity, a wonderful explosion of creativity happening in all kinds of places, even in prisons. So I think when it comes to the future of Arab space exploration, Muslim space exploration, I think that future can be indeed very bright. The Arab world, the Muslim world, has the technology, especially if it collaborates with other countries, not just European and North American countries, but also countries such as South Korea, China, Japan. The Muslim majority countries, especially if they pool resources, if they pool the resources of the Gulf countries, for instance, they have the money to engage in exciting space projects in the future. And the Muslim world certainly has all the imagination necessary to take humanity to Mars, to other planets, and maybe even to other galaxies at some point. Thank you very much.